My name is Danielle Critchlow, and I'm 22 years old. This August, at my graduation dinner, a restaurant my mother had picked out months in advance, 20 of our relatives gathered to celebrate the first college graduate in our family. My stepfather, Reggie, stood up with a champagne glass and gave a toast that made everyone cry. He talked about how proud he was. He talked about my degree from a top engineering school. He talked about the $118,000 a year offer I'd accepted at a Cleveland tech firm starting in 2 weeks. He called me his girl. He said he'd never been prouder of any child of his. 3 hours earlier, in his home office with the door closed, that same man had backed me into a corner, jabbed a finger at my chest, and told me I was a baggage my mother had dragged into his life, that I had no right to flaunt my degree and my offer over the family, and that his real son, his blood, deserved everything I had and would have it if there were any justice in the world. I'd recorded the entire thing, not on purpose. I'd had my phone out, voice memo running, rehearsing the toast I'd planned to give at dinner, the one where I'd thank my mother and the family for getting me here. When Reggie pulled me into his office, the recorder kept running in my pocket. I didn't even realize it until later, sitting in my bedroom shaking, putting on lipstick like nothing had happened, that I noticed the timer ticking up on my locked screen. I checked. There it all was. Every word. I didn't decide anything in that moment. I just stopped the recording, went to dinner, smiled for the photos, watched my stepfather raise his glass and praise me to 20 people he'd just told me, in private, didn't deserve any of this. And then my mother got up to use the restroom. The second she was out of earshot, Reggie leaned over toward me, glass still in his hand, the proud father smile still on his face for the rest of the table. And he said it again, quietly, just for me. Remember what I told you? You're your mother's baggage. None of this changes that. Wade should be sitting in your chair tonight. He said it the way a man says something he's been getting away with for years, casually, without fear. Because Danielle never reacts. Danielle keeps the peace. Danielle is the quiet one who lets these moments slide because her mother is happy, and her mother's happiness matters more than her own dignity. I looked at him. I didn't argue. I just said, into the table loud enough for the relatives to pause their conversations and turn. I actually recorded the last 37 seconds of my speech earlier today. Would everyone like to hear it? And before he could stop me, I pressed play. His own voice came out of my phone speaker. 3 hours of stepfather, captured in 37 seconds. The corner of the office, the finger in my chest. Baggage, your mother's baggage. Wade deserves it more than you ever will. My mother was just walking back from the restroom when she heard it. She stopped in the middle of the floor. The entire dining room had gone quiet. And while my stepfather's voice was still playing, while he was still, in his own words, calling me a piece of luggage my mother had been foolish enough to bring into his life, my mother slid her wedding ring off her finger and set it down on the table. And the marriage that had lasted 12 years ended in the time it took 37 seconds to play. Before I go any further, if you've ever protected someone from a truth you thought would destroy them, only to find out the truth was the thing they needed to know all along, take a second to like and subscribe. It helps this story reach the people who need it. And drop your city and the time where you're listening from in the comments. I love seeing how far these stories travel at night. I'm Danielle. This is the story of a stepfather who got away with calling me names in private for 10 years, the mother I tried so hard to protect from him, and the 37 seconds that finally made the truth too loud to ignore. To understand the recording, you have to understand how I ended up being the kind of daughter who'd record her stepfather, and the kind of daughter who, for 10 years before that, never said a word. My mother is named Lorraine, and she is, for what it's worth, the best person I know. I want to be clear about that from the start, because the rest of this story will involve her not seeing something she should have seen. And I don't want anyone listening to come away thinking my mother was complicit in what Reggie did. She was not. The thing that makes this hardest is that my mother is exactly the kind of mother every kid wishes for. Warm, attentive, in your corner, fair when she had to be fair, fierce when she had to be fierce. She raised me alone for a long time after my father left, when I was around 7 and stopped calling and eventually stopped existing in our lives the way absent fathers do. He's still alive somewhere. We don't speak. He's not the story. What matters is what my mother did with the years after he left. She worked 2 jobs and didn't complain about it. She made our small apartment feel like a place where a kid could be safe and silly. She came to every school thing. Even when it cost her sleep, she didn't have to spare. She was the kind of mother who could sit on the edge of your bed at midnight and ask one question that made the whole bad day come out in pieces. And then she'd put it back together with you. I have never doubted for 1 second of my life that my mother loves me. That's the part that has to be understood before any of the rest of this makes sense. She met Reggie when I was around 10. He came into our lives the way the second husbands in single mother families often do, slowly, gently, attentively. He brought my mother flowers. He made her laugh in a way I hadn't heard her laugh since before my father left. He treated her like she was the smartest, prettiest, most miraculous woman he'd ever met. And watching her be treated that way after years of being treated like an inconvenience was something I cannot describe to you. She bloomed. My mother, who had been carrying our entire life on her shoulders for 3 years, finally got to set part of it down. And the relief on her was so visible that I would have agreed to almost anything to keep her in that room. I remember, specifically, the night I first realized she might be in love. We were at a little diner the 3 of us went to sometimes. Reggie had been dating her for maybe 4 months. He told some story about something funny that had happened at his job, and my mother laughed so hard she had to put her napkin to her face. And when she lowered it, she looked at him with the expression of a woman who was, against all of her own instincts, beginning to hope. I was 10, and I had never seen my mother look at anyone that way. I had certainly never seen her look at my father that way in the years I could remember. Whatever Reggie was, he had made my mother look at the world like it was finally a place that might be good to her. That image, my mother's face, hopeful, lit by a diner light, is what I held in my head for the next 12 years. It was the thing I was protecting. It was the thing I would not let myself be the cause of taking away. And Reggie was, on the surface, a good stepfather. He came with his own son, Wade, 2 years older than me, his child from a previous marriage. The four of us blended, more or less. Reggie was generous in the early years. He paid for things. He took us on small vacations my mother had never been able to afford. He told me at the wedding that he was honored to be in my life now, and he hoped someday I'd think of him as a real father. I want you to know how badly I wanted that. I was 10. I just watched my mother be picked up off the floor by a man who seemed to know how to love her. I wanted to belong to that. I would have given Reggie anything for it, which is why what happened later cut so deep, because I gave him everything, and he took it, and he turned it into a weapon. The problem started around the time I turned 12, and the problem in essence was that I was smarter than Wade. I don't say that to brag. It just was what it was. School came easily to me. It did not come easily to Wade. I'd bring home A's. Wade would bring home B-minuses with a lot of justification attached. I won a regional math competition in 7th grade. Wade had been knocked out in the first round the year before. None of this should have mattered. We were children. Children are good at different things. A reasonable adult man raising 2 kids in the same house would have celebrated us each for what we were and not made it a competition. Reggie was not that man. What I figured out over years is that Reggie had built his entire identity around being a father who would produce a successful son. Wade was the proof of concept of his fatherhood. The kid he'd raised from the start. The kid he'd poured everything into. The kid who was supposed to validate Reggie's own life by becoming someone Reggie could be proud of. And Wade was, by every measure, an ordinary boy. Sweet enough. Decent enough. But ordinary. He was not going to be the trophy Reggie had decided he was going to produce. And then there was me, coming up alongside Wade, in the same house, getting the better grades, winning the competitions, drawing the praise from teachers, accumulating in plain view the kind of academic future Reggie had been counting on for his son. And I have spent years thinking about this. I think Reggie could not bear it. He could not bear that the smarter kid at his dinner table was not his blood. He could not bear that the kid he hadn't raised was overshadowing the kid he had. Every A I brought home was an indictment of his fatherhood. Every trophy of mine was a thing his son didn't have. I was, just by being myself, exposing the lie at the center of his whole identity. So he started very quietly to take it out on me. If you've ever been quietly resented by someone who could never admit out loud what they were resenting you for, tell me in the comments. I think a lot of us have lived in houses where the air felt slightly wrong and we couldn't for years name why. It started small when I was around 12. A snide comment here, a loaded sigh when I won something. The way he'd say after I came home from a science fair, "Well, some of us have to work hard for our grades, don't we, Wade?" Cut so small a child can't quite name them. Things that, if you tried to describe them later, would sound like nothing. By the time I was 14, the pattern had hardened. It was always when my mother wasn't in the room. Reggie was meticulous about that, almost surgical. Mom would step out to take a phone call, go to the grocery store, drive Wade to practice. The second the door closed behind her, Reggie's face would change, not into rage, into something colder. He'd find a reason to come into the kitchen where I was doing homework. He'd stand a little too close. He'd make a comment. "You think you're so smart, don't you? You think your mother's so impressed." "Wade studied for that test for a week. You barely cracked the book. You think that's something to be proud of? Don't get used to this, Danielle. People like you peak early. Wade's going to leave you in the dust by the time you're both 25. I'd be 12, 13, 14, standing at a kitchen counter holding a pencil with this 50-year-old man telling me my future was a mirage. And then I'd hear my mother's car pull into the driveway, and Reggie's face would smooth itself out. And by the time she walked in the door, he'd be cheerful again, complimenting her hair, asking how her day was, throwing his arm around her shoulders. And she'd look around the kitchen and see her daughter doing homework and her husband being warm, and she'd think with relief that the family she'd built was a happy one. It was not a happy one, but she had no way of knowing. I want to talk about why I didn't tell her, because I think that's the part of these stories people understand the least. When you're a kid in a step family, and the only step parent your mother has ever been happy with starts being unkind to you in private, you do not have the option of just telling her, or you do, technically. But the cost of telling is not a cost a kid is equipped to pay. If I told my mother, one of two things would happen. Either she wouldn't believe me, and I'd be alone in the house with Reggie knowing I'd tried to expose him and having lost, or she would believe me, and her marriage would be in crisis, and the woman I had watched bloom for the first time in my memory would have to choose between her daughter and the second life she'd built. And I knew with the certainty of a child who has spent years watching her mother carry too much, that whatever my mother chose would break her. If she chose me, she'd lose Reggie. If she chose Reggie, she'd lose me. Either way, she'd be back to that woman I remembered from before, exhausted, alone, carrying everything. So I made the deal a lot of us make. I said, I will absorb this. I will be the place that lands so that she doesn't have to land anywhere. I'm 12, 14, 16. I'm tougher than she is right now. She's just learned how to be happy. Let her be happy. I can take a few comments. I can take a finger in my chest, and I can take being called names in a kitchen. I can take it and not break, because if I break, she breaks, and I cannot be the thing that breaks her again. That was the deal. I made it with myself when I was 12, and I kept it for 10 years. And here's the part that, looking back, hurts the most. I underestimated her. The truth is, and I know it now, and I am still putting it together with what it means, that my mother would have chosen me. She always would have. The signals were there. If I'd had the courage to see them, every big decision in our family, every fork in the road where Reggie and I had a quiet disagreement, my mother had landed on my side. Not loudly, not by humiliating Reggie, but consistently by gentle, final word. Reggie, Danielle's going to that school. Reggie, this is Danielle's decision. Reggie, please. She'd been quietly choosing me my whole life in the rooms she could see. She just couldn't see the rooms Reggie made sure she wasn't in. I didn't believe she'd choose me, so I didn't give her the chance. That's the thing I have to live with. My silence wasn't really protecting her. It was protecting me. from the terrifying possibility that I'd ask my mother to choose, and she wouldn't choose me, and the last person on earth I belonged to would be gone. So I never asked, and she went on loving me and choosing me whenever she could see the choice, and not knowing that the man beside her at the table was undoing me one kitchen comment at a time. By the time I got to high school, I'd figured out my way through it. I would be excellent. Reggie wanted me to be small. I would be the opposite of small. He wanted me to peak early and disappear. I would not. Every A he tried to take the wind out of, every competition he sneered at, every comment that ended with, "Don't get used to this." I let it land. I went to my room and I worked harder. He was, in his way, the most relentless tutor I ever had. He had decided I would fail by 25, and I had decided I would not. And the math problem of my adolescence was him. I got into a top engineering school, industrial engineering, the science of making complicated systems work, which is funny in retrospect, because I was already an expert in making one particular complicated system work, my family. I'd been optimizing it for years. I knew exactly which inputs produced which outputs in our house. I knew when to disappear and when to be visible. I knew how to be small around Wade, so that Reggie's mood would stay even, and my mother could stay happy. Industrial engineering is the formal study of what I'd been doing instinctively since I was 12. College was the first time in a decade I lived in a building Reggie was not in. I cannot describe to you what that did. The quiet, the not bracing, the waking up in a dorm room knowing that no one in the building had decided in advance that I was going to fail. I bloomed there, the way I'd watched my mother bloom when she met Reggie, except mine was the bloom of a person who had simply been let out of a small room. My grades were exceptional. My professors put me forward for things. I did 2 internships, one of them at the kind of company that recruits at top engineering schools. By the spring of my senior year, I had a full-time offer in my hand, a starting salary of $118,000, a job in Cleveland, a signing bonus, the works, a new grad role at a major firm, my future. In writing, I told my mother first. We were on the phone. She cried, joyful, proud, undone crying. And she said, oh, honey, all those years you worked, you did it. You really did it. And I cried too, because for the first time I could let myself feel proud of something out loud, with the person who had made it possible. And then she put Reggie on the phone. I have never forgotten what Reggie said when my mother put him on, because it's the exact sentence that should have told me everything about how the next few months were going to go. That's great, Danielle, really, we're very proud. That was it. Flat, polite, the voice he used for his book club. And in the background, I could hear my mother saying excitedly, Reggie, isn't that wonderful? Isn't she amazing? And Reggie said, yes, dear, she really is. And I sat in my dorm room with a $118,000 offer letter on my laptop, 22 years old. And I felt, for the first time in my life, scared of my stepfather in a new way. Because the resentment of a stepfather toward a 12-year-old who's beating his son at math is a contained thing. The resentment of a stepfather toward a 22-year-old daughter who has just landed the kind of job his son will never land, that is something else. That is a man who has been telling himself for 10 years that I would peak early and fail, and who has just been handed proof that he was wrong. I should have known what was coming. Looking back, the warning was right there. But I had spent a decade keeping the deal. I will absorb this. I will not let it touch her. And I thought I could keep the deal a few more weeks. Through the graduation, through the dinner, through the move into my own apartment. And then I would be gone, out of the house, out of his reach. I just had to make it to the end of August. I almost made it. The graduation itself was beautiful. My mother flew out for the ceremony, watched me walk across the stage, took 100 photos. Reggie did not come. He had work, which was frankly a relief. The day belonged to my mother and me. We had 2 days in town together, just us, eating overpriced food and laughing. And I watched my mother look at me with the expression mothers wear when their kid has done something they can't quite believe. That weekend was, in retrospect, the closest the two of us had been since I was a small child. Just her and me. No Reggie. The way our life used to be. We flew home together to Cleveland, where the family was. The graduation dinner was scheduled for the following weekend. A real celebration, the whole extended family. A private room at a nice restaurant my mother had booked back in May. My mother had been planning it for months. She'd ordered a cake. She'd written notes for her own toast. She had been, since the day I called with the offer, like a woman counting down the days to a holiday she'd waited her whole life for. Her daughter had made it. The family was going to gather. There would be champagne. She was glowing. And in the days leading up to it, Reggie was, on the surface, fine, pleasant, helpful. He carried boxes. He congratulated me at the table. He asked polite questions about the new job, about the apartment I'd signed for downtown, about my start date. He played the proud stepfather flawlessly, and my mother glowed harder, because in her eyes, the man she loved was celebrating her daughter with her. I should have known he was loading the pressure somewhere. Reggie did not do well with being pleasant for too long. The valve was somewhere. I just didn't see where. I watched him over breakfast in those days and noticed his jaw tightening when he thought no one was looking. I noticed the way he stopped asking Wade about his own job prospects, as if even raising the topic of work would make the comparison too obvious. I noticed that Wade, 2 seats away at the breakfast table, had grown very quiet. Wade had been working a job he hated, a job that paid maybe a quarter of what I'd been offered. And I think Wade understood, with the particular instinct of a son who has spent his life reading his father's face, that something was building under the surface of those last polite days. I just didn't see what was building. I was too close to the door. It turned out the valve was the afternoon of the dinner. In his office, with the door closed, while my mother was downstairs setting out the family photo albums she planned to bring to the restaurant. The recording exists because I am the kind of person who rehearses. I had written a toast, short, careful, full of love. I wanted to thank my mother in front of the family, in words I'd practiced enough to get out without crying. I'd worked on it for 2 days. And the afternoon of the dinner, with maybe 4 hours to go, I went up to my room, opened the voice memo app on my phone, and I started practicing. I'd read the toast out loud, listened to it back, adjust the words that sounded stilted, do it again. The recorder was running on a low table next to my bed. I had just finished my third take when Reggie's voice came down the hall. "Danielle, come into my office. I need a word." You learn over 10 years to read the temperature of a voice. That voice was the temperature I had spent my entire adolescence being afraid of. I left my phone on the table, still recording. I want to be clear about this because it matters. And I walked down the hall to his office. He closed the door behind me. The recorder in the room behind me kept running. But at that distance, through a closed door, it would not have caught anything. I thought I had left it. I had not. Because somewhere between my room and his office, I had absent-mindedly picked the phone up and put it in my dress pocket the way you pick up your phone without thinking when you're about to walk anywhere. I didn't notice. The voice memo kept running, now in my pocket, 6 inches from my hip, as Reggie closed the door and turned around to face me. I remember the next part very clearly because the recording has helped me remember it. He stood very close. He pointed at my chest, and he said in a voice that was almost a whisper because my mother was downstairs, and the door was thin. "Listen to me. Tonight, you are going to keep your mouth shut about that job. You are going to be humble. You are going to give my son the dignity of not having to sit through a bragging session from his stepsister. Do you hear me?" I said nothing. I had learned at 12 that saying nothing was the safest answer. He kept going. "You are your mother's baggage. That's what you are. You always have been. Your father didn't want you. She had to figure out what to do with you. And I am the one who has put a roof over your head for 12 years and put up with your attitude. And now you think you get to come home with this fancy degree and this fancy job and rub it in this family's face. Wade has been struggling. Wade has been working. Wade should be getting the offer you're getting. And he would be if there were any justice in this house. You don't deserve it. You never did. You got lucky, and you got the right teachers, and you played a game my son was too honest to play. And tonight you are going to remember what you actually are, which is a piece of luggage your mother dragged into my life, and you are going to behave accordingly. Do you understand me?" I understood him. I nodded. He patted my cheek almost gently. He said, "Good girl." And he opened the door and we both walked back into the rest of the house. And 4 hours later, I was sitting at a restaurant in a private room with 20 relatives, while that same man stood up with a champagne flute and called me his girl. The phone was still in my pocket. I had not stopped it. I would not realize 4 hours. The dinner started, and on its surface, it was lovely. The room was warm. My grandmother, my mother's mother, the only grandparent I had, was telling everyone within earshot that I was the smartest child to come out of our line in 3 generations, which embarrassed me and also secretly fortified me. My cousins were there. My mother's brother, my Uncle Dewey, who I've always loved, was there with his quiet wife. The cake sat on a side table waiting. The waiters were kind. My mother kept looking at me across the table with the particular pride of a woman watching the thing she has worked her whole life to actually arrive. And Reggie performed beautifully. He stood up with the champagne. He talked about the long road I'd walked, how he'd watched me grow into the young woman I'd become, how proud he was. He looked at my mother when he said the part about being proud, sold it directly into her eyes, The picture of a stepfather who'd grown to love the kid he'd inherited. The relatives raised their glasses. My grandmother dabbed her eyes. Wade, 2 seats down, gave a small, thin smile that did not reach his eyes. I noticed it then, and I'll come back to it. I sat through the toast with my hands in my lap and my face arranged into the expression of a grateful daughter. And I felt the bizarre vertigo of being praised in public by a man who had, 4 hours earlier, called me a piece of luggage. I'd been doing variations of this performance my whole life. The dinner was just the highest stakes version of it. Toward the end of the toast, my mother excused herself quietly to use the restroom. She had been holding back tears all evening, and I think she needed a minute to compose herself before her own toast, which was coming next. The second she was out of earshot, Reggie's smile shifted 1/2 a degree. I cannot describe it more precisely than that. Anyone else in the room would have read him as still smiling. I read him as the man in the office. He leaned slightly toward me, glass in hand, expression unchanged for the relative's benefit. And he said, quietly, almost playfully, the way a man who has gotten away with this kind of cruelty for a decade learns to drop a knife at a dinner table. Remember what I told you. You're your mother's baggage. None of this changes that. Wade should be sitting in your chair tonight. I looked at him for a long second, and then I looked at my phone, sitting face down beside my water glass, where I had set it after the 3rd toast rehearsal that afternoon, where it had been ever since, where it had spent the 4 hours since his office still doing what I had asked it to do at 3 in the afternoon. And I understood, finally, what was in it. I want to tell you what I felt in that exact moment, because it's the part I think about most. I did not feel triumphant. I felt something much stranger, a kind of slow, awful calm, the calm of a person who realizes that the deal she has been keeping for 10 years is about to break, and there is nothing she can do to stop it, and also nothing she should do to stop it. I had been protecting my mother for 10 years. I had been carrying his comments, his cornering me, his finger in my chest, his baggage, his peak early. His Wade should have it, all of it, alone. I had told myself I was protecting her. And here, in my pocket, on a recording I had not asked for and had not engineered, was the proof that she had needed all along. Proof that did not require her to choose between her daughter's word and her husband's. Proof that did not depend on her believing me. It was just his voice. He had handed it to me himself. The universe had, in some small kindness, allowed a phone to be in my pocket while a man told a 22-year-old she was luggage. I could erase it. I could keep the deal. I could let Reggie give his toast and let my mother finish her happy evening. And tomorrow I would move into my own apartment. And the deal would have lasted just barely all the way through. Or I could play it. And I realized, sitting at that table with my stepfather smiling at the relatives and my mother walking back across the dining room toward us, I realized that the deal had never been mine to keep. The deal had assumed I knew what was best for my mother. The deal had assumed she couldn't handle the truth. The deal had assumed she would choose Reggie, when in fact she had been choosing me in every room she could see for 12 years. I had been making her decisions for her since I was 12. I had decided, without asking, that she was too fragile to know. And in deciding that, I had let her sleep next to a man who whispered baggage at her daughter in private. I had given Reggie 10 years of cover by refusing to test what my mother would do if she knew. She deserved to know. Not so she could rescue me. I didn't need rescuing anymore. I was 22 and moving into my own apartment in 2 weeks. She deserved to know because she was a grown woman who had built a life next to a person whose actual face she had never seen. And at 50 years old, she had the right to look at her own marriage clearly. The deal had been condescension dressed up as protection, and the deal was over. I picked up my phone. I unlocked it. I tapped into the voice memo app. I selected the recording from 3 hours ago. I said, "Into the table," loud enough for the relatives to pause their conversations. I actually recorded the last 37 seconds of my speech earlier today. Would everyone like to hear it? And the relatives turned politely toward me. Reggie's eyes did the thing where the smile stays on the mouth, but leaves the eyes, a tell I had watched my whole adolescence. Wade, 2 seats down, lifted his head with sudden attention. My mother, just rounding the corner from the restroom, paused in the doorway, smiling, expecting to hear me give my prepared toast. I dragged the playhead to the end of the recording, where I'd been speaking the closing line of my real toast just before Reggie called me into his office. I pulled the slider back by, I am guessing here, in retrospect, about 37 seconds, which put us in the middle of the office, and I pressed play. His voice came out of my phone, clear and quiet and unmistakable, the way it had been with the door closed. "You are your mother's baggage. That's what you are. You always have been. I am the one who has put a roof over your head for 12 years. Wade should be getting the offer you're getting. And he would be, if there were any justice in this house. You are going to remember what you actually are, which is a piece of luggage your mother dragged into my life." The voice played in a quiet room. No one moved. My grandmother had her hand at her mouth. Uncle Dewey had set his fork down very gently. Wade was staring at the table. My mother was still standing in the doorway. She had not taken another step. She was listening to the voice of the man she had been married to for 12 years explain to her daughter, in his own words, exactly what he thought of her. I watched her face. I will be watching her face for the rest of my life. It did not move dramatically. It did not crumple. What I watched on my mother's face over the course of those 37 seconds was a woman recalculating a decade of her own life in real time, every odd moment, every time Reggie had been a little short with me, every time I had gone quiet at dinner, every time she'd thought Danielle's just being a teenager when I was 12, 14, 16, and trying to disappear so Reggie's mood would even out. She was running the tape back, and the tape, for the first time, had a soundtrack. The recording ended. "Do you understand me?" And then faintly, my own voice, small yes. And then Reggie's voice, almost tender. "Good girl." And then silence. The dining room held its breath. My mother walked very slowly to the table. She did not look at Reggie. She did not look at me. She set her hand on the back of her chair, the way a person sets their hand on something to make sure the world is still solid. And then, without sitting down, without saying a word, She reached for her left hand, and she slid her wedding ring off her finger. She set it on the table next to her water glass. Reggie finally spoke. "Lorraine, honey, that's been edited. That's not what it sounds like. My mother held up one hand. Just one hand. The hand that had, until 40 seconds ago, been wearing his ring. "Reggie," she said. Her voice was very calm. "Don't." That was all she said. "Don't." And the entire family heard in that one word that 12 years had just ended. She turned and walked out of the restaurant. I followed her. We left him there in the private room with the relatives and with the cake. What I remember most about leaving, and I think about this often, is the quiet. The way 20 people we had loved our whole lives parted to let us through without saying a word. Because there was nothing in any of their lives that had prepared them for what they had just witnessed, and they had the grace to simply give us the door. My grandmother stood up as we passed and put her hand on my mother's arm. That was the only contact in the whole room, and squeezed it once, and then let us go. Uncle Dewey caught my eye and gave me one small nod that contained more comfort than any sentence could have. The relatives, in their wordlessness, made it clear in the only way they could. The family was leaving with us. Reggie was the one being left behind. He was the one who would have to figure out alone how to walk out of that restaurant past tables of strangers who hadn't been at the dinner but had heard, through walls, what he was. I drove. My mother was not in a state to drive, and I had not had wine. We didn't speak the whole ride back to her apartment. Her apartment, the one she'd kept in her own name through all 12 years of marriage, which now strikes me as the most quietly significant thing my mother ever did. The whole drive, she just held her hand in her lap, the bare ring finger pale where the band had been, and looked out the window. I let her have the silence. There would be a lot of words later. The first hour belonged to the quiet. Atiwar. I want to tell you about the days after, because they were not the days I expected. I had expected my mother to be devastated, to collapse, to need to be put back together by her child, the way I had been afraid my whole life she would. The reason I had kept the deal for 10 years was that I had been certain that telling her would break her. She was not broken. She was furious. And she was furious not at me, and not even primarily at Reggie, although yes, of course, at Reggie. She was furious at herself. I sat next to him for 12 years, she said to me the morning after, at our kitchen table, in the apartment she'd lived in with me before Reggie, and which, mercifully, she had kept in her own name. I sat next to him, and I never saw it. How did I never see? I tried then to take it back, to tell her it wasn't her fault, to tell her Reggie had been careful, surgical, that he'd only done it when she was out of the room, that she couldn't have known, that I'd helped him keep it from her by never telling her. And that was on me. And my mother, 50 years old, sitting at a kitchen table at 7 a.m. with no makeup and no wedding ring, looked at me with an expression I had never seen on her face. It was not anger. It was the deepest grief I have ever seen on a person. "Danielle," she said, "sweetheart, you were 12. You were a child, and you were carrying that by yourself for 10 years to protect me. That isn't your job. That was never your job. The job was mine, and I missed it. I missed it for 10 years because I was so happy he wasn't your father. I never looked closely enough to ask whether he was someone good. She started crying then. Quiet crying. Not for herself, for me. I would have chosen you, she said. I would have chosen you in a second. You know that, don't you? You have to know that. And I told her, through my own crying, yes, I knew that. I'd known it on some level for years. I'd just been too scared to bet on it. If you've ever found out late that the person you were trying to protect was stronger than you'd given them credit for, tell me below what it felt like to learn it. I think the discovery that we underestimated someone we loved is one of the hardest, sweetest things a person can carry. My mother filed for divorce within the week. It was, as these things go, simple. The house Reggie owned was his. The apartment she owned was hers. They had not commingled finances the way long marrieds usually do, which now I think she had been quietly arranging for years without admitting it to herself. The legal part of it took less than 2 months, and it was not in the end the story. The story was what happened around it. Wade reached out to me about 3 weeks after the dinner and asked if we could talk. I almost said no. I owed Wade nothing. He had benefited from Reggie's resentment of me for a decade. Every time Reggie cut me down, Wade had gotten the implied lift that you're the real son. You're the one who matters. He was 24 years old. He had been there. He had to have known. But I went. We met at a coffee shop, neutral ground. He looked terrible. He told me, and I believed him, that he had known, in pieces, that his father treated me differently, that he had not known the words his father used, that he had benefited from the family structure that elevated him over me, and that he was now looking at the whole thing with horror, including his own part in it. He was not asking me to forgive him. He was asking, he said, if I would consider, at some point in the future, being able to be in a room with him as siblings of a kind, because he did not want to lose me alongside losing the father he had just discovered he had. There was one moment in that conversation that I keep coming back to. Wade said very quietly that he had spent his whole adolescence trying to be what his father wanted him to be: the smart son, the successful son, the son worthy of the trophy his father had decided to produce, and that he had always failed at it, and his father had always blamed him for the failure. He had not realized, until the recording, that the failure was never his. His father had set a standard no son of his was ever going to meet, because the standard had been built around a kid who didn't exist. Wade had been competing his whole life against a fantasy. And in his father's mind, the fantasy son had been beaten in real life by me, the wrong kid, the step kid, the one Reggie wasn't supposed to compare his real son to. Wade said he had grown up feeling, vaguely, that he was disappointing his father. And now he understood that he had been set up to feel that way by a father who needed someone to be the disappointment so that he, Reggie, wasn't. We were both, in different ways, casualties of a man who could not be wrong. I told him I'd think about it. I'm still thinking about it. Wade is not the villain of this story, and he is not the hero of this story. He is a man working out late that the structure he grew up inside of had a price someone else was paying. I'm willing to let him work that out. I'm not willing to do it for him. Reggie, I haven't spoken to. He sent one letter. I returned it unopened. He attempted, in the early weeks, to recast himself as the wronged party, to tell anyone who would listen that the recording was misleading, that he had been frustrated, that I had ambushed him. The recording, of course, is what it is. There is no editing it into something else. 37 seconds of his own voice, in a tone no one who heard it could mistake for anything else. The relatives who had been at the dinner, who had heard it themselves, did not need him to interpret it for them. He lost the family that night. He lost his uncles and his sister and his nieces, all of whom had been there. He lost quietly the whole social standing he'd built up over 12 years of being the charming second husband. He has Wade still, but Wade is a grown man and not a constituency. My mother and I are still working out what we are now. She did not, in the end, fall apart. She did the opposite. She set her jaw and began rebuilding. She got a new haircut that took 5 years off her face. She took up something she'd given up when she met Reggie. She went to therapy. She made me go to therapy too, which I had been resisting because, of course, the daughter who absorbed everything quietly for 10 years was always going to resist talking about it. She insisted gently. I went. She also, gradually, started doing the small things that had been crowded out of her life by 12 years of running Reggie's household. She joined a walking group with women her age. She went back to painting, which she'd done before my father left, and had never picked up again. She made a friend, a real friend, the first new friend in over a decade. A woman from her painting class named Pam, who had been through her own late 50s divorce, and who showed up at my mother's apartment one evening with a bottle of wine and the words, "Honey, we are going to make these next 20 years count." My mother told me about that night on the phone, and she was laughing. I had not heard her laugh like that since I was a child. The therapy is helping, I think, mostly because of what it's making me articulate to myself, that the deal I made at 12 was a deal a 12-year-old should never have had to make, and that I had been carrying it as an adult woman even after the deal stopped being necessary. The hardest thing has been letting my mother apologize. She wants to apologize again and again for the years she did not see, and I want to absolve her because I love her and because the apologizing hurts her. But the therapist has explained to me with great patience that absolving her too quickly is its own kind of protecting her, and protecting her was the move I had spent 10 years on, and was the move that had let Reggie get away with everything. So I am learning to let her sit in her own remorse, the way she has had to learn to let me sit in mine. We are both, in our different ways, putting down old jobs. She told me last week that she wishes she had heard the recording years ago, that she would not have wasted the years, that she is angry at the time she spent unable to see what was right in front of her. I told her, and this is the truest thing I know, that I do not think the years were wasted. I think she was given the time she was given to be happy in her own way. And then she was given the truth when she could bear it. And a person does not get to choose exactly when those things arrive. The 37 seconds came when they came. They came at a dinner she had planned for me, in a room full of people who loved me, on a night when she had been about to give her own toast. They came at the moment they came, and they ended the marriage they were going to end. And she was, in the end, strong enough to hear them. That is what I know. That is what I told her. I moved into my own apartment on schedule 2 weeks after the dinner, a 1-bedroom downtown I'd picked out myself. I started the job. The $118,000 turned out to be real money. I take my mother out to dinner whenever she's free, on me, every time, no protest, because for 12 years she paid for things I now make enough to pay for, and I want her to feel, even in this small way, that her daughter has come into her own. She's good. She is, in fact, the best I've seen her in years. The bloom she had when she first met Reggie, which I now understand was partly performance, partly relief. That bloom is gone. What's replaced it is something quieter. A woman who is 50 years old and who knows finally what she will and will not accept in a partner. A woman who does not regret the second marriage exactly. She got me to where I needed to go, she says on Reggie's roof, and there is no taking that back. But who will not be replacing him for a long time, if ever, and who is, in a way I did not realize a person could be, peaceful about that. People ask me, the few who know the full story, whether I regret playing the recording, whether I should have just kept the deal a few more weeks and moved out and let my mother find out or not find out on her own time. And I think about the version of me who would have done that. The Danielle who had spent a decade making my mother's decisions for her, deciding what she could and could not handle, treating her like the fragile woman of my early childhood, instead of the actual grown woman she had become. That Danielle would have moved out quietly and let Reggie keep his arm around my mother's shoulders for the rest of her life, and the price of my silence would have been her continuing to be married to a man who had whispered baggage at her child. I don't regret it. Not for a second. I regret that I waited until I was 22. I regret the 10 years before. But the playing of the recording itself, in that dining room, with 20 relatives present, and my mother just turning the corner, no. That was the kindest thing I have ever done for my mother, even though it ended her marriage. Maybe especially because it ended her marriage. She had spent 12 years next to a man whose actual face she had never seen. The 37 seconds gave her his face, and the woman I had been so terrified of breaking turned out to be the woman who could finally, at 50, look at her own life with clear eyes and decide what to do with the rest of it. My stepfather called me my mother's baggage. My mother set her ring on the table and walked out of the restaurant beside me, in the same direction, the way she always had been walking, the way I had been too afraid for 10 years to trust. I wasn't her baggage. I was her daughter. And in 37 seconds, in his own voice, on a recording I had not planned and had not deserved, the man who had spent a decade trying to convince me otherwise gave my mother the proof she needed to finally, fully choose me out loud. She did. She does. She always would have. I just had to stop being afraid to let her.